Despite smashing box office records, Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy received relatively limited representation in video games throughout its run. Batman Begins was ultimately the only one of the three films to receive a tie-in video game for consoles following various doomed ventures. One such project entered pre-production while The Dark Knight Rises was being developed, hoping to deliver a AAA game that would live up to the films that inspired it. To learn more, I dive deep into the history of the company responsible for it, speaking to former staff that were a part of its creation. Monolith Productions is a studio based in Kirkland, Washington, which initially became known in the early 2000s for such titles as Tron 2.0. One of the biggest games in their history, Fear, arrived at a pivotal moment for them. Midway into development on this horror-themed first-person shooter, the company was in 2004 purchased by Warner Bros. Fear launched to positive buzz in 2005, drawing attention for its advanced enemy AI and slow-motion combat mechanics. The game ran on Lithtech Jupiter Extended, the latest iteration of the in-house engine which Monolith had for years cultivated. Fear released first on PC before being ported to Xbox 360 and PS3 by another company, Day One Studios. Meanwhile, a sequel to Fear was put into development at Monolith after Warner Bros. Acquired the IP from its original owners, Vivendi. Fear 2 Project Origin, which continued to expand upon the Lithtech engine, arrived in 2009 to mostly positive reviews. Its sales performance was strong enough to allow for another sequel, although according to former developers, Monolith Productions had little desire to make one themselves. Following over 5 years of working on the series, some of their developers were ready to tackle something new. On the other hand, Warner Bros. Was ready to pursue a third game, having gone through the trouble of untangling legal complications around the Fear name by buying it outright. For Fear 3, development duties were handed off to Day One Studios due to their experience with the franchise. It was at this stage that Monolith began to weigh up other possibilities. For the first time since being bought out by WB, they were free to peruse the catalogue of well-known pre-existing IPs at their disposal. Multiple possibilities were under consideration at this time, chief among which was a game based around Lord of the Rings. This demo is said to have had a focus on co-op gameplay and flirted with the concept of procedurally generated rooms. Exploring these dungeons as one of a few different characters and battling hordes of creatures was the aim of the game. This early prototype, said to have been worked on by a small team, was never picked up, but marked the beginning of the company's lasting fascination with Tolkien's world. It was around this time that the studio was also trying its hand at another Warner Bros. IP, Batman. The superhero franchise at the time was one of the media giant's hottest properties. 1 year earlier, The Dark Knight had grossed over $1 billion internationally, being met by fan and critical praise alike. The Caped Crusader garnered further acclaim in 2009 after making the transition to video games in Rocksteady's Batman Arkham Asylum. Warner Bros. And Monolith decided to capitalize upon the success of both with a new game set inside the Christopher Nolan Batverse for Xbox 360, PS3 and PC. Their hope, according to former developers, was that it would in some fashion tie into a planned third Batman movie. The game, codenamed Project Apollo, was set to feature a vast open-world Gotham City. To achieve this, Monolith began modifying the version of the Lithtech engine used for Fear 2. Since that title was much smaller in scope than their planned Batman game, this was a lengthy process. The vast majority of work on Batman, which is said to have lasted approximately 18 months, involved the developers re-engineering their technology for this more open environment. In the meantime, there appears to have been a degree of uncertainty about the project's direction. Ideas about the exact structure the game would take were somewhat vague. Former developers described hopes for linear story-driven missions plotted around a world players were free to explore, with one comparing it to Insomniac's 2018 Spider-Man game. Little appears to have been set in stone, however. This sense of uncertainty was contributed to in no small part by the developers having no guarantee that they would even be able to use Christopher Nolan's world. In order to access it, it was specified that Monolith would require the director's explicit approval. This was not simply a matter of getting the green light from Warner Bros. Alone. Multiple sources from the project claim that Monolith ran into repeated issues with trying to contact Nolan, who at the time was otherwise engaged with projects of his own. Regardless, the developers continued through an extensive pre-production period, hoping Nolan would eventually sign off on it. They were already planning how they would leverage the Nolan movies, including their iconic tumbler vehicle, which players would have been able to drive freely around the map. Like many other parts of the game, developers say that this element was not yet fully implemented, although a 3D model was made for it. Another former member of the team shared one of their hopes for the game, that it would capture a sense of verticality other Batman titles had been unable to. As such, their Gotham City was made up of many tall structures for Batman to make use of, leaping off them to attack from a distance. An artist from the project claims there were plans for 3 different possible approaches to situations. Batman could apparently utilize stealth to pick off enemies one by one, use his strength in hand-to-hand combat, or rely upon his gadgets for a less direct approach. Some of the planned missions involved such objectives as rescuing civilians, performing heists, and beating up groups of thugs. Work on Project Apollo ran through into 2011, but while production was ramping up on the 3rd Nolan Batman movie, Monolith's undertaking had been unable to get off the ground. Without Nolan's involvement or approval, the project found itself at an impasse. Word from former staff on why Monolith had not received the go-ahead from him varies. Some claim the filmmaker simply had no interest in it, wanting to focus on his own works like The Dark Knight Rises. Others suggest that his non-involvement in Project Apollo stemmed from something more than indifference. The director had previously signed off on the Batman Begins game that was made alongside the movie. Developed by Eurocom and published by Electronic Arts in 2005, the title was sold upon its strong ties to the film. It even featured original voice performances from its actors such as Christian Bale, Michael Caine, and Liam Neeson. Reviews, however, billed it as fairly mediocre. A couple of years later, another video game using Nolan's Batman had been in the works at Pandemic Brisbane, which was intended to tie into The Dark Knight. Actors from the film again signed on to feature in the game before it was cancelled at the end of 2008, and the studio behind it was shut down by EA. For years, rumours have since persisted that Nolan's opinion of the medium was soured by these past experiences, and that this may have contributed to his disinterest in revisiting it. Regardless, the end result was that Apollo never received his stamp of approval, forcing Monolith to consider other options. Sources from the project say that the team did look into retrofitting the game into an original Batman story that would draw solely upon the comic books. This test animation, posted to Twitter by former Monolith animator Nick Kondo, shows us what this could have looked like. But since Rocksteady was already finding success with this approach and preparing to release a sequel, Arkham City, there was little room for another big-budget original Batman game in the WB portfolio. Apollo was shelved in mid-2011, but several accounts from ex-developers indicate that the year and a half spent on it didn't go entirely to waste. A number of sources asserted that Apollo shared DNA with another project that had been in the works alongside it. In 2010, the company had attempted another Lord of the Rings game referred to under the codename of Project Hydra. This third-person action-adventure featured a fully original plot that, according to artist Wayne Laybourne, was hoping to capitalize upon hype around the impending Hobbit movies. It followed the adventures of an unlikely duo, an elf assassin and a dwarf hunter. The two were thrust together on a journey through the forests of Mirkwood and beyond. The Untitled game was a linear, narrative-driven experience built around 2-player co-op. One player controlled the elf, while the other played as the dwarf, and each had their own unique playstyle. The battle-hungry dwarf named Gorvin could deliver heavy blows with his hammer, while the agile elf character wielded an elven sword and a bow. They would fight their way across Middle-earth, taking on all manner of dark forces. Gameplay would have been divided between combat sections and stretches of puzzle platforming, in which the two would need to work together to carve a way forward. There were also said to be ideas for light RPG elements such as skill trees and different items that could be equipped to apply buffs. A demo video was produced in 2011 as the developers pitched the game to Warner Bros. The proof of concept had the two characters going up against hordes of creatures in an ancient dwarven cavern. It was proposed as a game for Xbox 360, PS3 and PC, but the publisher could not be sold on it. The developers I spoke to recalled a handful of different reasons as to why this was. One member of the team believed it was down to the absence of a clear plan for the game's direction, while another blamed doubts about the viability of co-op-centric experiences like it. On the other hand, there were also said to be concerns about how marketable the two heroes were. WB apparently held some trepidations about how mainstream audiences would respond to the two leads being fantasy race characters, reasoning that this would hinder its chances of success. Midway into 2011, Monolith again went back to the drawing board, reworking their concept. Their new direction responded to the criticisms of their parent company. It abandoned the co-op focus and their original main characters. The protagonist was now a human, referred to as the Ranger. Not only that, the game's scope was widened considerably, moving away from a linear Uncharted-like experience and adopting an open world setup. The size of the world was ultimately cut back somewhat, and the game would eventually evolve into 2014's Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor. Former employees told me that in its infancy, the project heavily leveraged the tech developed for the Monolith Batman game, including the modified Lithtech engine made to support an open world. Its connection to Project Apollo may run far deeper than that, however. Some developers say that its combat was based upon what was already built for Batman as well. One artist claimed the two were so heavily connected that early prototypes for Shadow of Mordor even used a model of Batman holding a sword as a placeholder. The technology which randomizes the enemy orcs to look different from one another in Shadow of Mordor is said to have originated from Apollo as well. A developer who was a part of both projects told me that it spawned from a system in Batman that would randomly generate thugs. Enemies in Shadow of Mordor will taunt the player if they have previously lost to them in battle. Conversely, the player can intimidate them into retreating if they prove their might in combat. Sources have suggested that these AI behaviors were evolved from those made for Batman's thugs. Although projects Apollo and Hydra never officially came to be, the two paved the way for games that did release. Ideas from Hydra in particular are said to have also been used in another Monolith game, Guardians of Middle-earth. A nod to Hydra's original premise can be found in Shadow of Mordor. The dwarf character Gorvin was implemented into its plot as the deceased brother of the hunter Torvin. Players must help Torvin avenge him by slaying the legendary Graug that took his life. For more content like this, please don't forget to subscribe. You can support my research on Patreon like these kind people did. I've been Liam, and I hope you'll join me for another Game History Secrets.